Good morning, and welcome to day 2 of Reckoning and Reimagining, Envisioning a Faithful Presence in the Liberal Arts. My name is Mary Wong, and I'm the chair of this conference. Thank you to those who attended yesterday and those of you who are joining us right now. Today, we feature 8 sessions, including interdisciplinary presentations and roundtables, an invited panel on healthcare, and 2 sets of presentations on anti-racism and sociopolitics, in addition to our keynote. Note that the keynotes and presentation sessions will host a live Q&A session for a more dynamic experience. For the Q&A, please type in your questions as you think of them in the Q&A feature during the talk, and the host will ask the questions at the end. Also, note that today we'll have a final gathering following the last afternoon session. So please remain in the socio-political presentation or click on that link at 2:40 to join us for that. Finally, for any technical issues, remember to email the conference email. It's 2021lilyconf@apu.edu. After I pray, Dr. Denise Edwards-Neff, Interim Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at APU, Professor of Communication and PI of the Lilly Grant supporting this conference, will introduce the APU Provost, Dr. Rukshan Fernando. But first, let me pray. Lord, Jeremiah 29:7 says to seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare, you will find your welfare. Our incarnational God who came to be among us and not just watch from above, help us, we pray, to be your faithful presence where you have sent us. Forgive us for not engaging as we should with those who are oppressed, and for not taking more time to listen and being Christ to those to whom you have called us. Help us climb down our ivy towers and venture out of our safe cloistered gatherings to apply the disciplines we so cherish to address the challenges around us that we have come to see more clearly. As we engage in this conference, help us envision how our disciplines in the liberal arts and our passions and skills that you have gifted us with can be honed and applied to seek justice and wholeness of others. Amen. Denise?
Good morning. It is my pleasure to introduce APU's Provost, Rukshan Fernando. Dr. Fernando is committed to APU's mission of outstanding faculty, staff, and administrators, shaping students in their academic, professional, and spiritual capabilities to make a positive difference in their workplaces, communities, and homes. His research and teaching expertise lie in the arenas of leadership identity, higher education administration, and inclusive excellence. One of his main passions is to empower APU's diverse student body to grow in its capacity to facilitate wholeness in the world. Prior to becoming provost, Dr. Fernando was interim dean of the School of Business and Management, interim head of university libraries, and associate dean in the School of Behavioral and Applied Sciences at APU. He has been a consultant to non-governmental organizations in Sri Lanka, Ecuador, and Nigeria, as well as a technical expert for the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development and the United States Department of the Treasury. He was selected to participate in Harvard University's Management Development Program and the WASC Senior College and University Commission's Assessment Leadership Academy, and has secured research grants related to leadership, poverty, diversity, and sustainability. Dr. Fernando also is active in his community as a governing board member of the Glendora Unified School District. Dr. Fernando.
Hi, my name is Rukshan Fernando. I'm the Provost here at Azusa Pacific University, and I just want to welcome you to this regional conference funded by the Lilly Fellows Program. And Azusa Pacific University is so excited to have you from all over the country to discuss some important issues in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Reckoning and reimagining. What a time to reckon and to reimagine who we are as scholars in this world. And we are so excited also to have 2 premier scholars known for their work throughout the country in Dr. Willie Jennings and Dr. Jane Hong. I, of course, know Dr. Jane Hong well and appreciate her work and have worked with her, but also Dr. Jennings so appreciate the voice and the ability to clarify the importance of anti-racist work in today's world. So really want to thank you both for participating in this conference, but also welcoming all of you from all over the country to discuss these very important issues of how the COVID pandemic does impact our world and what does it mean to have a faithful presence, especially in the liberal arts today, in light of all of the shifts that we are experiencing here in the world today. So again, grateful for the support that we have received from the Lilly Fellows Program, who have been a supporter of us and a collaborator with Azusa Pacific University for many, many years now. And we hope that you are enjoying this conference, learning from it, and are able to take the wealth of information from scholars across the country back to your institutions to continue to reimagine the work that you do.
Welcome everyone to day 2 of APU's Lilly Fellows Regional Conference. My name is Joshua Canada. I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships in the Office of the Provost at Azusa Pacific University. I am elated to introduce Dr. Jane Hong. Jane is an associate professor of history at Occidental College. She received her PhD in history from Harvard University and is the author of Opening the Gates to Asia, a Trans-Pacific History of How America Repealed Asian Exclusion. It was published by UNC Press in 2019. Her current project considers how post-1965 Asian immigration changed U.S. evangelical institutions and politics. The book, under contract with Oxford University Press, connects 2 historical developments rarely considered together: the rise of the religious right and the demographic transformations of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. On a personal note, I am really excited to have Jane here because of her exquisite ability to produce quality academic work, as well as engage the broader public in issues of justice and equity, and all of that driven by her faith and her commitment. She is a wonderful person to get into discussions with, to get to know her scholarship, but also her convictions underneath them. With all that to say, it is my honor to welcome Dr. Jane Hong as our Day 2 keynote speaker for APU's Lilly Regional Conference on Reckoning and Reimagining.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Hong. I'm a history professor, and I specialize in Asian immigration and U.S.-Asia relations over the 20th century. Today, I'm going to talk about histories of Asian American Christianity and Asian American Christians. But in order to understand Asian American Christian history, you first have to understand Asian American history. And so I think, there are a number of themes that I wanted to highlight for us, because I realized that for many folks in the United States, not a lot of folks learn about this history beyond maybe Chinese exclusion, Japanese American incarceration. Those are the 2 topics that people might encounter in a high school history class or a college history course. But there's a lot more to understanding Asian America. And so I want to highlight some of those key themes today. And my hope and my goal in talking about Asian American history today is to give us a better understanding of how we got here to a place of peaking anti-Asian violence during a period of COVID-19 pandemic. But I want to situate today, in this moment that we're living in, within the context of a much longer history of anti-Asian racism and violence. And I also want to think about the role that the church and that Christians have played in this history. So just to start us off, I first want to highlight that Asian America is an incredibly diverse category. So when we think about Asian America, we might think about the largest US Asian groups on the left. So we think about Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, South Asians, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese. And historically, before the 1980s, Japanese Americans were the largest Asian American group in the country. But in reality, Asian America is incredibly diverse. And if you look at the category Asian American today, it encompasses over 50 different ethnic, linguistic groups. And these groups are incredibly different. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got to the place where you have very diverse groups grouped together under this one category, and talk about the history of how that happened. But I just want to highlight a few things first, because I think this will help us understand our present moment. So when we think about Asian America, it's an incredibly socioeconomically diverse group. So not only is it ethnically diverse, linguistically diverse, people speak different languages, people come from different kind of ethnic groups, but it's also the racial group in America with the most socioeconomic diversity, or the greatest class inequality between its richest and poorest groups. And you get a sense of that on the right in this bar chart. Now, if you notice here, Asian Americans are also often grouped with Pacific Islanders, but Pacific Islanders have a distinct history in the United States. And so out of respect for the distinctiveness of Pacific Islander history, I'm going to focus primarily today on Asian American history. But I'm very open to questions about where Pacific Islanders kind of fit within the story, and similarities, contrasts. I'd be happy to address some of those questions if folks have them later. So I'm going to focus on Asian America in particular. And just to give us a sense, right, Christians make up about 42% of Asian Americans, and this is a statistic from about 10 years ago. So this might have shifted since then. But this category here of Christian, this Pew Research support encompasses Catholics, evangelicals, as well as mainline Christians. So 3 themes I'm going to overview historically that'll help us understand where the category Asian American itself came from. The first is the perpetual foreigner, this idea of kind of where are you really from? Asian Americans get that question a lot, and usually, you know, when folks ask me that question, for example, they don't expect me to say New Jersey. They're interested in hearing the name of some Asian country. And so the question is, where does that come from? Why is there this assumption that Asians are somehow either immigrants or kind of recent immigrants, or Asian Americans are always somehow assumed to be connected to some Asian country? Why do people always assume that? So we're going to talk about how that history is rooted in the history of Asian exclusion in this country. So we'll look at immigration and naturalization law. The second theme we're going to focus on is the model minority, because that's the other theme that oftentimes defines how Asian Americans are viewed in American society. So on the one hand, folks wonder, are Asian Americans really American? And on the flip side, some folks wonder, you know, Asian Americans look pretty successful, at least socioeconomically. Why can't everyone be as successful as Asians, right? So I think this is a question that really emerges in the 1960s amid Black Power and protest movements during that period. So we're going to talk about that as well. And the final theme that I want to focus on is the Asian American movement. So what is Asian American identity? How was it conceptualized from the very beginning? And how does it propel action? So what does it mean to be Asian American in the 1960s, 70s, and onward? But then also, how should that inform how people understand Asian American activism today, especially within the church and especially in our present moment? So let's take the first theme, Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners. Where are you really from? The assumption that Asian Americans are always somehow indelibly extensions of Asia or some ancestral Asian homeland. So in order to understand this theme, we have to look at the history of US immigration laws. So, you know, many folks have probably heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. That's the one that if folks learn about Asian immigration in the classroom, you'll learn about that law. That law specifically targeted Chinese workers, and the goal was to keep Chinese workers out of the United States in order to prevent labor competition, in order to prevent the heathen Chinese from entering and threatening American Christian white civilization. This is a story in which California features very prominently. It's a site of a lot of labor unrest among Irish workers who formed labor unions like the Working Man's Party. And the Working Man's Party and other groups are at the vanguard or at the forefront of calls to bar Chinese from the United States. I think that one of their most famous calls is the Chinese must go, right? This was a very common slogan in the late 19th century, so the late 1800s. More recently, after the Atlanta shootings in March of this year, 2021, the Page Law got a lot of attention in different news pieces. Mainstream media covered the Page Law because the Page Law is passed even earlier by Congress, and the target of that law is Chinese women. And Chinese women were particularly targeted because they were assumed to be prostitutes. And so under this law, people being brought in for, quote, lewd and immoral purposes would be excluded from the country. And so many news pieces, many historians, many scholars have been talking about how these ideas about, or these connections between Asian women and sex work, prostitution, how these ideas are not just ideas from 2021, but also have really deep historical roots. What fewer people realize, however, is that after these very kind of early laws were passed targeting Chinese workers and women, Asian exclusion laws, so Congress expands Asian exclusion to encompass all of Asia. So by 1917, Congress creates the Asiatic Barred Zone. And so the term Asiatic, right, in many ways, it's similar to what we consider Asian American today in terms of who it encompasses. So Asiatic, Congress draws a big line or a big rectangle around Asia, and it basically says nobody from these countries can enter the United States for long-term immigration. So temporary visitors are okay, diplomats are okay for short-term trips, but long-term permanent settlement is barred from Asia. And so Asiatic becomes a category created in the law that's actually defined by exclusion. By 1924, Congress expands the Asiatic Barred Zone to also include Japan. And so the 1924 Act also reaffirms that Asians born outside of the United States are not eligible for US citizenship. So they're racially barred from US citizenship. And under the law, they're called aliens ineligible to citizenship. Filipinos are the one exception because the Philippines is a US colony until 1946. And so Filipinos come under exclusion by the 1930s. So by the time you get to the 1930s, no Asians are able to enter the United States for long-term permanent settlement. So some people still come back and forth, but generally speaking, Asians are barred. And they're barred from immigration, but as I mentioned earlier, they're also barred from US citizenship. And this is important because many scholars argue that these Asian exclusion laws basically racialize Asians as foreign, un-American, because Asians are generally barred and they're not, even those who do live in the United States are not able to become US citizens. So what are the consequences of this? The consequences are that for much of US history, the Asian population in America remains extremely low and growth rates are very low. That's because by the 1920s and 1930s, Asians are effectively barred. So immigrants are not able to enter the United States in large numbers. The only source of growth then, for the most part, is if immigrants, Asian immigrants in the United States have children. And those children, interestingly, they are able to become US citizens by birth. So there is that principle of birthright citizenship. So the only way Asians can become citizens or be citizens really is if they're born in the United States. So there's slight growth because immigrants have children. And so you see this trend, right, where the Asian American population grows really slowly. This begins to shift in the 1960s. And so between World War II and 1965, Congress begins to gradually repeal the Asian exclusion laws. So first in 1943, Congress repeals the Chinese Exclusion Act and gives Chinese the right to US citizenship. And Congress does this because the United States and China are allied during World War II. And so it's really for foreign policy reasons. And you see this same kind of principle between the 1940s and 1960s, where US Congress gradually repeals exclusion against Chinese. In 1946, Congress removes exclusion against Indians. It gives Filipinos the right to US citizenship. In 1952, all Asian countries and colonies are given very small immigration quotas of about 100 to 185 per year. And all Asians are given the right to US citizenship in 1952. So for the first time in US history, Asians are able to naturalize as US citizens without racial bars. Why does this happen? This happens because the United States has many interests, foreign policy interests, Cold War interests, empire building interests in Asia. And it's really because of US geopolitics and foreign policy that Congress begins to repeal these Asian exclusion laws. And the law that really changes everything is 1965. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. So Congress passes this, and to be very frank, most US lawmakers didn't realize that this law would change the immigration stream so dramatically. So before 1965, up to 90% of immigrants entering the United States came from Europe. And that's what most congressional lawmakers wanted to continue this trend after 1965. And so they carefully crafted the 65 Act. So there's two pieces to the 65 Act that are relevant. The first really emphasizes job skills and qualifications. So the United States decided to give visas to people with particular job skills that were needed in the United States. So medical professionals, engineers, and many folks in those fields. And the second piece of this law was the family reunification piece. So if you had an immediate family member or even an extended family member who was a permanent resident or a US citizen, you were preferenced for a visa to enter the United States. And so Congress passes this law and pretty much assumes that these two pieces would ensure that immigration remains primarily European. But the people who chose to enter and the people who chose to take advantage of this new law were not primarily people from Europe. It was primarily people from Asia and Latin America. So beginning really after this law is passed, the immigrant stream since the late 1960s has been majority Latinx and Asian American. But this was not necessarily what most congressional lawmakers had expected, or even what most of them had wanted. The other thing 65 law does is it makes Asian America more diverse. So before, as I mentioned earlier, before the 1960s and 1970s, Japanese Americans were the largest Asian American population, and Japanese and Chinese Americans made up the vast majority of Asian Americans. But the combination of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act and post-Vietnam War refugee migrations from Southeast Asia and later from other parts of Asia, refugee migrations, have completely diversified the Asian American population into what I mentioned earlier, an umbrella category that encompasses over 50 different ethnic and linguistic groups from many different religions, representing many different class and educational backgrounds. So that really is, right, this story, what we see today as Asian America, in many ways, right, is a product of post-1965 immigration, refugee migration and immigration under the 65 Act and subsequent laws. And the other piece to Asian immigration that's incredibly important to remember and to think about, is this idea of US intervention, US military involvement, US foreign policy, US empire in Asia. It's a really well-known quote by historian Gary Okihiro, where he basically argues, right, Asians came to America because Americans first went to Asia. So this principle applies really throughout all of US history, beginning with the arrival of US military personnel, as well as US missionaries and US business interests in the 19th century and even before, really. So you begin to see small waves of migration through these agents. But it's really in the 20th century with World War II and the Cold War, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and all these different kind of US military interventions in Asia, that you see larger and larger numbers of Asians coming to the United States. And it's really no coincidence that beginning in the 1940s, 50s, you have more and more Japanese and Koreans coming to the United States in very small numbers, right? So some of them are able to enter as the brides, right? The brides or the spouses of US GIs. Some enter as adoptees. And so you still have really small numbers of Koreans and Japanese coming, largely because of the US military presence in those countries. And then once you get to the Vietnam War in the 60s and 1970s, as I mentioned earlier, right, there are disruptions caused by the war that create incredibly large refugee migrations. And so this isn't, and I do highlight Korea, Japan, and Vietnam in particular, but US military troops were really stationed throughout Asia during this period and even today. And so really, wherever Americans go, there are military disruptions, there are other disruptions that create Asian migrations to the United States. So really, Asians came to America because Americans first went to Asia. So US militarism in Asia is an undeniable and really important part of the history of Asian immigration to the United States. The second big theme is Asian Americans as model minorities. And the question that often gets asked in these early pieces in the 1960s is, why can't everyone be as successful as Asians? And so when we think about the model minority, the model minority idea is not just an Asian American thing, and it didn't begin in the 1960s. So there were earlier kind of versions of it before the 1960s applied to Black Americans, Mexican Americans, and others. But in the 1960s, it gets really popularized as applied to Chinese and Japanese Americans in particular. But since then, it's really become a theme, a trope that's applied to Asian Americans generally, even today in different guises. And some of the earliest pieces that are best known is one piece by William Peterson, who's a Berkeley sociologist who writes in the New York Times, Success Story, Japanese American Style, January 1966. Later that year, another author writes about Chinese Americans as a success story in US News and World Report, so December of the same year. And if you actually look closely at these pieces, what you notice is that, yes, the articles are about Japanese Americans and they are about Chinese Americans. And there's a lot of discussion about the cultural traits that enabled these groups to succeed. So for Japanese Americans, even after being incarcerated during World War II, right, they were still able to recover and socioeconomically kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps. So that's a very compelling tale in the 1960s. And a similar kind of narrative is ascribed to Chinese Americans. But as you see here with the quote on the left, if you actually look at these pieces, right, they are about Asian Americans, but they're not primarily about Asian Americans. Because the question that the authors are asking is, why are Asian Americans able to succeed when Black Americans are not? And so if you actually read the pieces, for example, the one on the left, right, the question is, why are Chinese Americans moving ahead on their own with no help from anyone else? And why can't other groups, primarily African Americans, do the same? So the important thing about this moment, right, in the 1960s, right, 1966, this is just within a year after the Watts riots in places like Los Angeles and racial unrest throughout the country. And there was a lot of discussion about poverty within African America. And the question was, why? Why are African Americans unable to lift themselves up by their bootstraps like other people, like Chinese and Japanese Americans? In both cases, so the authors use Japanese and Chinese American success to critique and kind of hypothesize about Black failure. So why is it, right, against the backdrop of race riots and Black power movements across the country? And what you see here are writers talking a lot about cultural arguments, right? There's some mention of structural factors like the history of slavery and Jim Crow that disenfranchised Black Americans for centuries. But generally speaking, these pieces focus largely on the cultural factors. And the argument is that Japanese and Chinese Americans have the right cultural practices conducive to success, while Black Americans handicap themselves and are responsible for their own plight. So this is why scholars often argue that the model minority isn't actually about Asian Americans. Instead, it uses Asian Americans as a tool of anti-Black racism to blame Black Americans for their own plight and to erase the structural factors, the historical factors that created the situation that you saw in the 1960s. So that's another part of the story where you kind of see Asian Americans being pitted against and used against Black Americans by officials in power, and both liberals and conservatives in power. And the third theme is Asian Americans as political actors, because this is really important. Asian Americans, many of them didn't like these narratives, especially for a generation of Chinese and Japanese Americans, largely US-born Chinese and Japanese Americans who had come of age, kind of many of them had experienced incarceration when they were young. So They had seen kind of the face of state-sponsored racism, structural racism firsthand. Many of them had seen their parents and other people in their community unable to get jobs outside of Chinatown, outside of little Tokyos and ethnic enclaves because of systemic racism. And many of them really did not like being used as a wedge or as a tool to criticize African Americans, because many of them actually saw themselves as sharing much in common with Black Americans and other racialized Americans who also faced systemic racism in different ways. And so a group of Asian Americans, mostly Chinese and Japanese Americans, some Filipino and Korean Americans as well, students at Berkeley and San Francisco State in the late 1960s, they formed a movement called the Asian American Movement. And so when we think about the term Asian American, the term that we use today is kind of a descriptor. The term Asian American was actually born as a political project. And it was meant to be, right, Asian American wasn't supposed to describe people. It was supposed to be an identity that you claimed as a political identity. So the idea that Chinese and Japanese Americans, they saw value in identifying themselves, not just with each other, but with all folks, right? All people with ancestries in Asia. And so the idea was solidarity among different Asian ethnic groups, number one. Number two, solidarity with other people of color in the United States. So Black Americans, Latinx Americans, Indigenous Americans, and others. And number three, solidarity with Asian peoples in Asia, especially during the period of the Vietnam War, when many of the activists in the Asian American movement specifically opposed what they saw as US imperialism in Vietnam. And if you look at some of the signs here, right, in this anti-war protest from 1970, right, support our Asian sisters in Vietnam, right, there is a sense of racial solidarity between Asian Americans in the United States with their Asian brothers and sisters who were being slaughtered by US troops in Asia. In the Asian American movements, you had Christians and church leaders get involved. And two that I wanted to highlight were Lloyd Wake and Roy Sano, so two Japanese American clergy who later became bishops within the United Methodist Church. And when asked about their motivations for getting involved in the movement, some cited the influence of the social gospel movement and its emphasis on addressing societal problems and the responsibility of Christians to address societal issues. And some Asian American Christians also cited their own experiences with American racism and state injustice. And in the case of Bishop Wake and Bishop Sano, both had been incarcerated in the Poston camp during World War II, along with their families and Japanese American communities. And both of them, in fact, were US citizens. So they were part of the 2/3 majority of the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated at the camp. So the majority were US-born citizens, like these two bishops. And their experience of state-sponsored incarceration shaped their theology and their firm belief that their ethnic and racial identities mattered to God, but that their identities also should inform how they do ministry, how they teach the Bible, and how they engage society. So you saw both of these bishops, they marched alongside student protesters. So by this time, they were both in their 30s and 40s. So they were several decades older than many of the student activists they marched alongside. In 1968 and 1969, when Asian Americans joined with the Third World Liberation Front to march at San Francisco State and Berkeley for the creation of ethnic studies departments and classes at these universities, both Bishop Sano and Wake marched alongside students. And the argument for these student protests in particular was that in order to achieve self-determination, to decide their own futures, students of color needed to first learn about their own histories, because for many of them, they had really never studied slavery in the classroom in the ways that they wanted. They hadn't really learned anything about the history of Chinatowns. They hadn't learned anything much about Latinx histories. And so the argument was, in pursuit of self-determination and community liberation, ethnic studies was really important to creating this kind of project. And so together they fought for the creation of an ethnic studies college with regular courses and faculty. And these student protests, these actions at Berkeley and SF State in 1968 and 1969 became two of the longest student strikes in US history. And in both cases, there were many skirmishes with the police. Students were arrested, students were beaten, students experienced violence. So there was a cost to their involvement. But by early 1969, both SF State and Berkeley had created ethnic studies courses, began hiring faculty, and even today, both of those universities have ethnic studies departments, in large part due to the student protests in the late 1960s. So we still have those today because of what folks like the students involved, as well as Bishop Wong and Sano, what they did in the late 1960s. For Asian American Christians like Bishop Sano and Wong, they were really interested in not only bringing ethnic studies and kind of knowledge of Asian American history, Asian American studies to secular universities, but they also wanted to bring this kind of history and knowledge to seminaries that trained pastors and church leaders. And they also believed that, this ethnic and racial consciousness should shape the organization and leadership structures of mainline Protestant denominations, like the United Methodist Church, of which they were both part. And so one of their main calls during the 1970s in particular was for ethnic caucuses that could empower ethnic minority leaders and pastors within the church and bring ethnic consciousness to bear on how seminaries and churches taught theology, both academic theology and lived theology. And so in 1972, Bishop Sano helped other Asian American clergy, such as Wilbur Choi, found an organization called PACS, Pacific and Asian American Center for Theology and Strategies. And the goal was really to, rethink faith and reorient ministries in light of the emergence of ethnic consciousness in the late 1960s. So an attempt to apply the ideas of the Asian American movement to reform the historically white American mainline church and its institutions. They were also interested in influencing biblical interpretation. So the idea that ethnic particularity mattered, and that ethnic and racial consciousness should influence how pastors are taught, how they're trained, how they interpret the Bible, and also how people understand and relate to God. The work of PACS and affiliated groups with PACS yielded fruit within mainline denominations, so in ways that remain with us today. And here are just a few examples. The United Methodist Church created the new Federation of Asian American United Methodists. The Presbyterian Church of the United States, so PCUSA, created the Asian American Caucus. American Baptists, had their own caucus as well, which recently became the Alliance of Asian American Baptists, which is an equal partner with the American Baptist denomination. And there are other examples as well. So when we think about what happens with Asian American Christian history after the 1970s, so the Asian population in the United States grows tremendously during the 1980s and 1990s because of post-1965 Asian immigration. And many of these newer Asian immigrants, they join evangelical churches, they join evangelical organizations, they found their own churches. And so there's a tremendous growth within Asian American Christianity. And just this mirrors the large kind of the broader story of a huge growth in Asian American population during the 80s and 90s. And this leads to a number of other conversations, particularly within evangelical spaces. And a very famous moment from these stories is the 1996 article in Christianity Today called Silent Exodus, written by Helen Lee. And in this article, Helen Lee talks about kind of the exodus of second generation English-speaking Asian Americans from the Asian immigrant churches of their parents, and questions about kind of where these Asian Americans are going, whether they're leaving the church altogether, whether they're joining majority white churches, whether they're creating Asian American churches of their own. And this is a story that, again, folks were talking about in the 1990s, but I think folks still talk about this today in terms of thinking about generational differences within Asian American Christianity. And really, even as early as really the 1970s and 60s, as we see, there is always this question about Asian American Christians and political activism. So with Bishop Sano and Wong, we saw, right, church leaders get directly involved in protest movements, anti-war movements, ethnic studies struggles, as well as pro-democracy movements in the 1970s that they were involved with as well. You know, I think this conversation is an ongoing conversation. And in our present moment, right, we see articles like these from Christianity Today, March of this year, 2021, questions about Asian American Christians and the Black Lives Matter movement, Asian American Christians and recent marches against anti-Asian racism, questions about how the church, the Asian American church and Asian Americans within the Christian church, what they can bring to this present moment. Like, what is the responsibility? What is the role of believers in promoting justice, racial justice for Asian Americans, but also for other people of color, for all people of color? And so these are questions that I believe people are still working out, still negotiating. But I think it's important as we think about kind of our present moment and the responsibility and kind of the engagement of Asian American Christians in this present moment, I think we need to remember that we are part, or Asian American Christians are part of a much longer history where Asian Americans have resisted, marched, protested, worked for justice, struggled for justice alongside other people of color. So, you know, the conversation today is not new. And the struggles that folks are having today about what role the church should take, these are not new questions. And so I think part of what I would like to offer to the conversation and the debates, the conversations today, is this historical perspective, to think about our elders, to think about how Asian American Christians in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, in the early 2000s, how they answered these questions and how they wrestled with kind of the responsibility of believers to society and to promote justice in society. So my hope is that knowing this history and realizing that our present moment and that we today are part of a much longer history of church activism and church engagement, my hope is that this would encourage folks and give us lights to look to in our own questions, in our own wrestling about the role of the church today in our present moment. Thank you.
So Dr. Hong, I want to thank you so much for that talk, and a lot of questions are coming in already. Folks on my introduction, but my name is Joshua Canada. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships in the Office of the Provost. We're going to just kind of jump in and do some Q&A and pose some questions and thoughts to you. So, one of the ones that we'll lead with is actually one that kind of came up for me as I was listening. So taking into account the model minority myth and it being an intentional method, right, for whiteness to position Asian Americans against Black folks, and this method of anti-Black racism. What do you see, or what are the pieces that you might see of a kind of continued opportunity for Black and Asian American, particularly Christian communities, to work together in solidarity, whether we see that in not Christian nonprofits, community advocacy work, or educational institutions? What opportunities do you see there?
I mean, I think that, well, first of all, just thank you for these great questions. I think, I think the first thing maybe to just step back a bit, when thinking about Black Asian American solidarity, or just solidarity among peoples of color, particularly Christians of color, and just Christians generally, I think it's really important for folks to just remember that there is a much longer history of solidarity. Because I think oftentimes when we hear, and even the model minority, the history of the model minority that I outlined earlier, I mean, that's really a history of folks pitting Asian Americans against other racialized communities in ways that still reverberate today. And I think that's partly why I wanted to highlight that history so much. But historians study history more broadly. There is a longer history of solidarity. Like in some ways, right, you could call them hidden histories. I think there's now on social media something called the May 19 Project, hashtag May 19 Project, where you can see different kind of snippets from US history. And May 19th, that date is actually the birthday of Yuri Kochiyama, who is a very well-known Japanese-American activist in New York City, and of Malcolm X. They actually shared a birthday, and they worked together in New York City. I think there are many examples of solidarity across history that we can draw from. And I think first, maybe one place for us to start is just to actually recover those histories and to kind of educate ourselves in the fact that the narratives today might be very much about the division, about the pitting against, right? But historically, one example I always think of is in 1869, Frederick Douglass, the famed abolitionist who himself had escaped slavery. He comes out in support of Chinese immigration. And Chinese immigration in the late 1860s is incredibly controversial. And there's a lot of, even by 1869, keep in mind, this is 13 years before the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed by National Congress. Frederick Douglass says, Chinese immigrants should be allowed into the United States, and they should be treated humanely because they're human, right? Because there's a human rights argument that you could make, in 1869. Obviously there are even more, right, historical examples of just a human rights argument. And I think as Christians, a human rights argument, I think, is sufficient, right? It's why should we care about folks who are different from us? Because Jesus cares, because we're made in the image of God. So I think many of us have been having these conversations recently. In terms of meaningful solidarity, I can think of examples, I can think of examples of groups that are trying to work together. And I think that is an amazing thing. There is, again, this longer history. And so that's why I also wanted to highlight folks like Lloyd Wake, and Roy Sano within the UMC, within churches. But I guess maybe what I'll do is just kind of say one or two things that I think are needed for that solidarity to be meaningful, because I think that's maybe a different way of framing this question. It's like, I think meaningful solidarity requires recognizing the distinctiveness of each community's experiences with systemic racism and just in this country generally. Because I don't think any of us, the reality is, I talked about how structural racism in the form of laws, so immigration naturalization laws, shaped Asian American experiences and racialized Asian American communities. But, I think law systems, structures have, shaped Black communities' experiences, Latinx experiences, Indigenous American experiences, and Eastern and Southern European, experiences. Because another piece I didn't talk about, I'm an immigration historian. There are immigration policies that explicitly discriminate against Eastern and Southern European immigration between 1924 and 1965, and that's another big part of the story. So I think systems, right, policies. They have played a different role in different communities' experiences. And I think it's important to not flatten those distinctions, but to recognize kind of the distinctiveness of each group experience, but also to think about what we share in common. And for Asian Americans, I think in particular, to work with Black communities, I've been seeing a lot of pieces and a lot of conversations happening both within the church and outside the church. For Asian Americans to work with Black communities in particular, I think Asian Americans have to be honest about times and just histories where Asian Americans have been complicit with anti-Blackness. That's just the reality. And I think that's important for folks to recognize, but also to repent of, right? I'm going to use the Christian term there. I think also for folks of color, but actually just Americans, folks generally, it's just to kind of retrain ourselves to think about structural racism as, something that affects different communities differently, but that structural racism is the problem, right? So it's not that we are in competition. So not to be in competition with each other, but to see what we share in common, which is, again, it's the harms and the ills of structural racism that pit us against one another. And I think starting there from a very honest place, right, is really necessary to build meaningful solidarity that can transcend particular moments. Because what I really don't want to see, and I think this is the heart of many folks. What I really don't want to see is just, to have this be a blip. Like all of a sudden people care about Black Lives Matter. All of a sudden people care about anti-Asian racism. And these are two different, right, phenomenon with different histories. But just the idea that like all of a sudden, right, people care for a particular moment of time. There are these efforts at, solidarity building, but then they're fleeting, right? I think that's not what any of us, well, that's not what I want. And I think that's what a lot of folks don't want. And so one way to just kind of think about a long-term solidarity is to, again, first start with recognizing the distinctiveness, but then also recognizing the things that we share in common.
Yeah. I reflect on like my own narrative and kind of anecdotal relationships. I think for some pockets of the Black community, knowing that systemic racism and exclusion that Asian Americans have experienced, that's something that is kind of off some folks' radar. So that there's kind of this acquiescence to the model minority myth that I think Black folks will have as well. And I think, as you said, that can kind of limit the ability to have solidarity, to see the specificity of how that structural racism has impacted various Asian American communities, but also that connectedness that we as peoples of color have both been impacted by it. And I think that last comment you made about the how do we have some longevity and make this more than just kind of this flashpoint moment. It's the 2020 is all of the movements were happening and put folks in the streets. There's a sense of hope that I had, but also the sense of at some point this is going to move out of the cycle for folks. So what do we do to sustain? How do we create coalitions that are ongoing? How do we change some of our systems? I think in education, how do we shift and give those experiences so that, as you talked about in the presentation, so that it is not that peoples of color don't hear their history and don't have that education, and they can be empowered to do these things. So, one of the questions that someone put in is about the kind of conservative Asian American, kind of evangelical Asian American church that sometimes tries to either avoid kind of racial conversations or political conversations, kind of maybe leaning into kind of this color blindness as it goes to diversity. What do you think, from looking at history and what you've engaged in, what do you think those barriers, what do you think they are? Where have they come from? Is there kind of a historical precedent that you could speak to?
So in terms of kind of the historical barriers that create these misunderstandings between communities?
Yeah. And particularly maybe the idea of not talking explicitly about race and getting politically engaged. So you've kind of shown that there's a history of that. For those who haven't engaged, from what you've seen, what was the reason why that lack of engagement was there, or lack of wanting to delve into issues of race?
Yeah, no, I think that, there's scholars obviously study this. I'm sure many folks who are listening know the work of Michael Emerson, who talks about just the ways in which evangelicals, particularly in the last few decades, have really latched on to this idea that, it's not about the structural, it's really about the interpersonal. And think about racism in terms of kind of like a Promise Keepers model, right? So I'm going to apologize to my brother and this will solve racism, but it's not really about policy or larger systems and structures. Historians study larger systems and structures. And I think, many scholars, sociologists who are watching this will understand what I'm saying. So I think there's that kind of mismatch between like the structural and the non-structural, right? So it's how do you even conceive of the problem of racism, so there's that structural versus non-structural understandings. And there's also historical versus present day understandings. So the color blindness, right, that idea is really premised on the belief that racism has been solved, or at least the worst ills of racism were solved with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, even though subsequently the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been gutted more recently by Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. So, I think there's that. So it's those two things, structural versus non-structural, so interpersonal versus structural, and historical versus present day. I think many folks are, scholars watching this, or folks who are in school, like people are thinking about these issues. Racism hasn't gone away. The Civil Rights Act of 64 didn't solve everything. And so the idea, the narrative that it has, right, I think that's very ill-advised. It's just wrong. And the other piece I think that's really built into this conversation is this question about, religion and politics, specifically Christianity and politics. And I've had different conversations with Christians. I know some folks are just uncomfortable even with the term politics. So sometimes people use the term like societal engagement versus political engagement. Like, I know how much of a hot button issue it is. Like, I can see that. But I think maybe two things that I'll say. The first is historians who study Christianity, and particularly historians who study evangelicalism. I'm speaking here about people like Darren Dochuk, John Fea. There's so many, actually. There's a whole cottage industry within US history of folks who study evangelical histories. Obviously, George Marsden and Mark Knoll are on that list as well. And then more recently, Kristen Dumais and Beth Barr. I mean, there's just so much we could talk about, because it's not just about race, it's also about patriarchy and just how the ways in which those things are entangled. The reality is, like, Christians, I think since the 1970s, I think as you mentioned earlier, my current project looks at the intersection between post-65 Asian immigration and the rise of the religious right. I mean, the way that historians write about post-1970s, we're talking about the moral majority, Jerry Falwell, Paul Weyrich, who was a Republican Party strategist. I mean, I think it's important for Christians just to know that in the 1970s, political action groups like the moral majority, they fused evangelical Christianity with the Republican Party. And so that's why by the 1990s, as Barry Hankins, historian at Baylor, has written about, by the 1990s, evangelical Christians were a really influential and important constituency within the Republican Party, right? They had something like 25 to 40% of delegates of the RNC in 1992 and 1996 were evangelical Christians. And so, we can see the continued influence today through people like Sarah Palin in 2008, right? Mike Pence in 2016. I think it's important for Christians to just kind of confront that history, because that's actually just, it's well documented. I mean, there's like interview after interview of folks, including Jerry Falwell, right, where he talks about, right, the responsibility that Christians have, But the idea that evangelical becomes this partisan identity, so not just a political identity, but a partisan identity in 1979 onward, or in the 1970s onward, I mean, that's just, it's well evidenced. And I don't necessarily think that idea should not be controversial, because it's so well documented and folks talk about it. It's there are like dozens and dozens of histories written about it. The question now for us is kind of what to do with that. Like, what do you do with that? And when you think about the ways in which, if you look in the news today, anyone who reads any news today will see the term white evangelical has become like a political or partisan identifier and in media, right, across the board, really across right to left. And so I think, Christians, because the larger question of why Christians have a hard time talking about race and racism really has to do, I think, with Christians having a hard time talking about and recognizing and kind of grappling and wrestling with their relationship to partisan politics. The reality is, though, that's the moment we're in, and this has been the history of the last 50 years plus, right? This is the more recent version of kind of Christianity and politics. But before the 1970s, there were different versions, and Darren Dochuk and other historians write about this. But maybe the last thing I'll say on this is a couple of weeks ago, PBS released a documentary. It's a really short one on Billy Graham. And I think I went to a number of webinars, and that the Billy Graham documentary is quite well done, PBS American Experience. They interviewed a lot of the historians that I read, kind of the biggest hits folks. I think I went to a number of webinars, and the comments were a mess. People were just so upset at the coverage and discussion of like Billy Graham and his relationship to Richard Nixon in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, and like Billy Graham and his relationship to presidential power. And, after Watergate, things do shift because I think, Billy Graham has these realizations, but people were just so upset. And I understand, and I actually tweeted about this because I grew up with Billy Graham too. I grew up in a Korean immigrant church. I grew up in a Korean immigrant household, but I read like Peace with God, like, I don't know how many times. I went to his crusades. I went to Billy Graham crusades at Shea Stadium, at Giant Stadium with my mom. Billy Graham was a big presence in my life. And so I understand why many Christians who learn this history, some of them feel actually quite betrayed. And that's what a lot of the comments were about. It's like, so either the anger was placed everywhere. It was targeted at everyone, but there was a lot of anger, frustration, and just disappointment and disillusionment. And that's difficult. And I know it's difficult to confront these histories, but I think as believers, it's a part of good stewardship and being responsible, because I do think, Christians should be engaged in society. And I think many folks who are here at this conference would agree with that, since it's all about, right, how Christians should engage with society. But I think that effort requires folks to grapple with this history, which is well documented by historians, many of whom would consider themselves strong believers themselves, right? These are folks who have spent years writing these histories. And so I think it's worth delving into that history, even just by starting, with that documentary, which I would really recommend.
Yeah. So there's a question that is a little specific, but going back to you naming the page law and how that had an impact. So the question is about kind of what percentage of Chinese women had been trafficked for sex in the Pacific Northwest, and how did that impact or kind of give a basis or some credibility to some of the claims that were made around the Page Act and allowed that to happen? So was there this genuine concern for prostitution because of trafficking of Chinese women?
I mean, I think it was both, right? Because when we think about that time period, there were lots of, the white slavery, concerns, that was more of a kind of late 19th, early 20th century that focused on prostitution among European women brought to the United States. There's just generally been a lot of involvement by the church, particularly women Christians, right, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries around issues of prostitution. So you see a similar kind of narrative with Chinese women during the 19th century. I've seen statistics. So a high percentage of Chinese women who were being brought to the United States, who were trying to enter the US during the 1870s, a high percentage of them were being trafficked because it wasn't, if you think about the 1870s, you have to think about who had the ability to pay for passage across the Pacific Ocean to come to the United States, who had the incentive to come. It wasn't a lot, generally speaking. I wouldn't say that, many women, because it was primarily a labor migration, right? So it was largely male because these were folks who were Chinese who were planning to come to the US, make some money perhaps, and then go back, right? It's called sojourning. They were actually planning to return to China. So largely, this early migration of Chinese was largely male. And then, yes, the smaller number of women who came, some of them were either like the wives or connected to men who were trying to immigrate to the US or enter the US. But yeah, there was a high percentage of women who were trafficked. And because that was, so there's a lot of ways to think about that. And I've seen a lot of good writing on this, but, on the one hand, it's about just kind of the trafficking of women more generally. So there's that piece. The racialized dimension, right? There is, even in the 19th century and even before, if you look at like European writings about Chinese, there's still this kind of sexualization, right? This hypersexualization of Asian women that actually dates back even earlier than the 1870s, right? So you could argue in part that it's those ideas that create the context in which, folks targeted Chinese women for trafficking, right? Because the idea was there would be demand for Chinese women if they were trafficked and brought in as prostitutes in the United States. So the demand is there among American audiences. And so, yeah, I could say more, but there is good writing about that piece. But yes, it really has to do with this larger history of kind of labor and trafficking, right, from Asia, and particularly the gendered and racialized dimensions of that labor trafficking.
So thinking about, again, the history and as an immigration scholar, you are kind of deeply in this, kind of the patterns of exclusion or kind of conditional and kind of hegemonic inclusion. Is there some necessity for us to kind of wrestle with kind of the definition of what it means to be American or a citizen of the United States, even kind of a different imagination of what that might mean, that that transcends, again, kind of the way that it's been hegemonic and controlled in the past, that would be more inclusive, more open, allowed to be diverse. What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, and I think this is a great question. And, the first week of my immigration history course, and not just me, but many immigration historians, that class is basically all about like who gets to be an American. What are the criteria, like who gets to decide? And a lot of, I think a lot of immigration history today focuses on law, like immigration and naturalization law as one very important site where those contests play out, right? Obviously, especially in the United States. I mean, so the kind of big debate is between this kind of civic nationalism, civic kind of identity. Americanness is a civic identity you can choose, right? So if being American is kind of identifying with the values of equality, liberty, right? These kind of American ideological kind of values. So an ideological, American as an ideological identity, like civic identity, versus American as a kind of racialized or ascriptive identity, like only particular racial groups can be American, right? And there's actually a major tension between these two kind of conceptions from the very beginning. And I think some historians actually just use these two conceptions to trace through all of US history and thinking about this question. And I think, you could do that because what you really see is at the beginning of the country, I mean, this is kind of in many ways at the heart of the 1619 project is who gets to be an American, kind of what role does slavery play in this, racialized slavery. The reality is, right, there are writers who are writing about, who is the American, like Hector Krevker is this farmer. He's like, who gets to be an American? Who's an American? He's a new man, right? From anywhere in the world, right? So it's as long as you ascribe to these kind of, ideologies, you can be an American. So there's that kind of freewheeling, kind of open-minded, a very kind of open conception of Americanness. But we have to contend with the fact that in 1790, Congress passes the Naturalization Act, which basically says who can become US citizens? Free white persons, right? So American national identity, American citizenship is actually racialized from the very beginning. And free white persons, that sounds kind of gender neutral, but persons in 1790 referred primarily to men, right? Because women, under legal codes of coverture, women were considered, their citizenship was derived, right, from the status of the men in their lives, their fathers or their husbands. That's why widows were such a big legal problem in the 18th and 19th centuries. And then, so in 1790s, this moment, free white persons of African descent are added after the Civil War, so during Reconstruction. And then over time, so Indigenous Americans are given citizenship, right, in 1924. And then as I mentioned earlier, it took until 1952 for US Congress to make US citizenship race neutral, as in there are no racial bars anymore. So, I mean, I think we need to contend with that tension in US history. Because I think that in many ways, it does very much kind of, I mean, it really shapes like my experience as a Korean American or Asian American woman, right? It's when I walk out into the street and folks ask me like, oh, where are you from? And I say New Jersey, and like nobody like is satisfied with that answer. I am from New Jersey, I was born in Brooklyn. But like that's not what they're looking for. They want me to talk about like how my parents immigrated from South Korea, and they want me to talk about all these different things. And, I am the child of an immigrant and I study immigration history. So like, I understand where a lot of these questions come from. And I am closer to the immigrant experience, but for folks who are like fourth, fifth, like who are many, many generations from like fourth, fifth, sixth generation Asian American, like Chinese American, Japanese American, like California's full of folks like that. Hawaii's full of folks like that. Like, for them, it's like they're so distant from that immigrant experience. And so again, it goes back to what I was talking about very early in the presentation. It's just, I would ask us to just really resist and rethink and just kind of just consciously resist those kind of assumptions about Asian Americans as somehow like really close to the immigrant experience, or, as Asian Americans is foreign. Like we should really just kind of be very conscious about that. Like if you see an Asian American face and then perfect English comes out of their mouth, like if you feel jarred, like if that's jarring to you, then I would really ask you to interrogate, to kind of like think about that and to sit with that and be like, oh, why do I assume that about Asian Americans, right? And how might that actually affect my relationships?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's like reinforcing the perpetual foreigner, because you keep that kind of schema in your mind. Yeah, I think about the South. I'm originally from Virginia, and not large, but Asian American communities that are kind of spread out throughout the South. So Vietnamese communities kind of deeper in the South, in kind of Louisiana. And for some, the fact that, oh, they have a Southern accent. Like, yes, because for some of them, generations have been in this place, and that kind of breadth of identity and expression of what it is to be Asian American. So we're coming to the end of the time. I kind of want to ask one last question that ties a few things in. So ties the fact that, I mean, you did this kind of excellent job at showing kind of the non-newness of Asian American activism. How do you see kind of the potential of that and specific shaping educational institutions, colleges and universities currently? And what are those things that you would even say kind of need to shift in our institutions to make sure that this history is told, to make sure that Asian American students and others are kind of understanding the history, legacy of systemic racism and these movements that have existed throughout time?
I mean, I think, educational institutions actually can have a really big part, I think, in reshaping or kind of reimagining, right? So going back to the theme of the conference, like what Americanness is and what American society could and should look like. I mean, I think ethnic studies is a really important piece of this conversation. And by ethnic studies, I am talking about specific, right, Black studies courses, Asian American studies, Latinx studies, Indigenous studies. So, I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier, you have Christians like Bishop Sano, like you have Christians who are involved in these movements because they saw the value of folks learning about themselves in the classroom. And, I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up in New Jersey. I think I did learn about Chinese exclusion and Japanese American incarceration, like in my AP US history, but it wasn't really until like my junior year of college where I was able to learn more about the history of Asian Americans in this country. And that was in an Asian American history class. I mean, different institutions have different structures, and I know that there are many students fighting for ethnic studies at different universities across the country. California, in many ways, is really ahead of the curve. I mean, again, I grew up on the East Coast. I went to grad on the East Coast, and folks are really fighting. They still have to fight really hard for those classes to be even taken seriously. But here at like UCLA, the UCs, like I'll be at the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA next year as a fellow. I mean, there's whole departments devoted, right, to these disciplines, which are now actually disciplines. They have their own journals, they have their own faculty lines, they have their own scholarship. And these scholarships are actually quite, I mean, I'm spending a lot of time recently reading about the Asian American movement. These are quite sophisticated disciplines and scholarships. And so, I mean, I think that, Christian colleges and universities like Harvard, right, have a long way to go in many ways. I'm not talking about, I don't know all, like every single Christian college or university, the curriculum offhand, but I think, a lot of schools, a lot of institutions have a long way to go in terms of bringing these histories into the classroom and making sure that students have at least a basic historical literacy and a basic grasp about this diverse history when they graduate. I mean, I think that that's really one important piece, like the ethnic studies piece. I think ethnic studies can also be incorporated within just classes more generally. Like I actually don't teach Asian American history at my institution because that's someone else does that. But I bring these perspectives into my US history survey, into my US and the world foreign policy class, into my immigration history class. Because, folks often say like, Black history is American history. Asian American history is American history. Latinx history is American history. So it's not like, it's not an either or, and I really want folks to just kind of hold on to that. It's not an either or. This is like our collective history. And so I think it's important to make sure that the history is representative. And so, I mean, the last thing I'll say is, I think you do see kind of these changes happening. I know in California, I've been following the ethnic studies curriculum bill back and forth. So I know that California, for example, has passed a bill that requires ethnic studies, a unit, to be taught in K-12 schools. I know there's a lot of debate over what the curriculum should actually look like, and that's currently where the situation is. So California, I think, again, is kind of really ahead of the curve in lots of ways, but I was very encouraged a few days ago, the Illinois state legislature passed the TEACH Act, which actually mandates that all K-12 schools in Illinois have to teach a unit of Asian American studies. And that law, that bill, was actually brought by like the first Indian American to serve in the state Senate. The first Indian American elected to the state Senate was the co-sponsor, and then a Chinese American legislator in the House, in the Illinois House. They were the ones who sponsored the bill, and the bill, I think, recently passed the Senate and now has to be signed into law by the governor. I know there are similar bills that are being debated in my home state of New Jersey, and I've seen like any number of other states. There are like Connecticut. I mean, there's a number of states who are kind of considering bills along these lines, and not just for Asian American studies, but for ethnic studies generally. And so I think it would be great if students heard some of these histories before they got to my classroom in college. And I think that educational piece is incredibly important to helping folks just kind of understand their place in a much broader and a much more diverse history than I think most of us learn before college.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, yes, for Asian Americans, but also for that solidarity, and it kind of recalls people to know those stories and know that those histories are American, they are US history kind of collectively. So Dr. Hong, I just want to thank you for spending time with us today. Both the presentation and this Q&A responses were just excellent. So thank you for coming, everyone. There are going to be some more sessions for the conference today, so please see the note that Mark just dropped in the comment section. We would love to see you there. Again, Dr. Hong, thank you, and I hope the rest of your day goes wonderfully.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.